Today on BenchBriefs, we're looking at a landmark Supreme Court of Canada decision that tackles the tricky balance between freedom of expression and fair elections. The case is Harper v. Canada, decided in 2004, and it asks an important question. Can the government limit what people say on Election Day to protect the fairness of the vote? Here's the story. Stephen Harper, yes, the same Stephen Harper who would later become prime minister, was a publisher who wanted to share election survey results on Election Day itself. But Canadian law, specifically the Canada Elections Act, said no. The act prohibited the publication or broadcast of any election survey results on Election Day before the polls closed. The idea was to prevent the last-minute release of polls that might influence how people vote, ensuring a fair and free election without pressure from last-minute trends or predictions. Harper challenged this restriction, arguing that it violated his right to freedom of expression under Section 2B of the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. He said that sharing information during the election is part of free public debate, and that banning this kind of speech was an unjustified limit on his charter rights. The Supreme Court had two main questions to answer. First, did this law prohibiting the publication of election surveys on voting day infringe on the freedom of expression guaranteed by the Charter? And second, if it did infringe, could that infringement be justified as a reasonable limit under Section 1 of the Charter? Section 1 allows the government to place limits on rights if those limits are reasonable and can be justified in a free and democratic society. The court agreed that the law did infringe on freedom of expression. After all, publishing election surveys is a form of expression, and the law clearly restricted what could be said on a key day in the democratic process. But the story didn't end there. The court had to ask whether this infringement was justified. To decide this, the court looked at the purpose of the law. The government's goal was to protect the integrity and fairness of elections. They wanted to avoid a situation where last-minute polls might unduly influence voters who hadn't yet cast their ballots. The court recognized that elections need to be free and fair, and that sometimes free expression can be limited to preserve that fairness. The court applied the test from a famous case called R.V. Oakes, which is used to determine if a limit on rights is reasonable. This test asks whether the law has a pressing and substantial objective, whether the means chosen are proportional to that objective, and whether the law minimally impairs the right in question. The court found that the objective was indeed pressing and substantial. Protecting the fairness of elections is fundamental to democracy. The law was also proportional because it only limited the publication of election survey results on one specific day, the day of the vote, and only until the polls closed. This was a narrow restriction designed to prevent last-minute manipulation or undue influence. Finally, the court concluded that the law minimally impaired freedom of expression. It didn't ban all speech about elections on voting day, just the release of new survey results that could sway voters. People could still talk about politics, discuss candidates, and express opinions. The law struck a balance between free expression and fair elections. In the end, the Supreme Court upheld the law. The restrictions on publishing election survey results on Election Day were a justified limit on freedom of expression under Section 1 of the Charter. Why does this case matter? Harper v. Canada highlights the delicate balancing act between two core democratic values, the right to free expression and the need for fair elections. It recognizes that sometimes, to protect the democratic process, governments can place reasonable limits on speech. It also shows how the Charter's rights are not absolute but can be shaped by context and competing interests. This case remains relevant today as we grapple with the influence of polls, social media, and last-minute campaign tactics. It reminds us that democracy requires not only free speech but also fairness and integrity in how elections are conducted. Thanks for listening to this episode of BenchBriefs. Join us next time as we dive into another important legal decision shaping Canada's justice system. Until then, stay curious and keep questioning.